Are joining today the Friday Food Preservation 101 series. And today we're going to be talking about pressure canning with our agent Janell Barber from Choteau County. My name is Brianna, and I am the Food and Family Extension Specialist. And I'll be facilitating this conversation today. But I do hope that you take this time to ask any questions you might have in the chat box. We will try to answer them as we go through our discussion today. If we don't get to them today, you will see them responded to in our recording and the follow-up email as well. We will have everyone who's joining on mute, but feel free to use the chat box to share insights or questions as well. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Janell to talk to us a little bit more about pressure canning.
All right, thank you for joining us, everyone, today. How is my volume? Can everyone hear me okay? A thumbs up, Brianna? Good? Okay, thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to be here today. This is a little weird, odd, to be looking into a computer screen and not be looking out to a bunch of individuals and their faces face to face. So this is definitely a new opportunity for me to be teaching or presenting this way. So bear with me. I know this will not be perfect, but we hopefully will share some information if you didn't already know, something that you can take away today. Looking at the chat, it looks like everyone has a lot of experience. So I almost feel like I could just walk out of the room and the rest of you could teach it, right? Okay, well, today, as Brianna mentioned, we will be talking about pressure canning, specifically low acid foods. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But I believe it was Miranda that said she was looking for beets to can this year. And that's exactly what we are going to demonstrate today. I tend to overplant my beets in my garden, as I did again this year. So it was a little bit selfish on my part to do this class, to also then prep my own beets and have a few of those taken care of on my own shelf. So our purpose for today will be to discuss what foods we do pressure can. What is pressure canning, the science and safety piece of that, and then the process of pressure canning. And specifically, like I mentioned, we will be canning some beets. All right. As we talk, you're probably all familiar with high acid foods and low acid foods. This falls on the pH scale. Brianna, could you do the next slide, please? And today, like I said, with the pressure canning, we are going to be looking at low acid foods. They have a pH greater than 4.6. These include most of our vegetables, pretty much all of them, meats, poultry, seafoods, legumes, and then mixtures that contain low acid foods. So you might have like a beef stew with the meat and the potatoes, which are both low acid foods. I have to refer to my. So when we are canning low acid foods, or especially under pressure, this means that our temperatures are getting at least 240 degrees Fahrenheit or even above that. At sea level, if you were to pressure can at 10.5 psi, you get at that 240 degrees. At 15 psi, you would be at 250. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit more about altitude. I just mentioned that briefly, but we will talk about that a little bit later as far as the adjustments that you need to make for your altitude. So why these two methods of canning? So water bath or boiling water bath that Katrin did a great job last week talking about that. If you did not already join us for that one, if you don't have the recording, please email Brianna and she would share that with you. But if you have it and have not looked at it, it is definitely a really good one to look at. So we won't talk much about that at all. But yeast, molds, and most bacteria are destroyed at boiling temperatures, and that's through the boiling water bath canning method or processing method, and that's at 212. So we all know that water boils at 212 degrees at sea level, right? Well, there are these other microorganisms. It's called Colistrium botulinum, and it creates these spores that can't be killed at the 212 degrees. They have to at least 240 degrees or above. Next slide. So when these spores are under the right conditions, they create a botulism toxin, and that is what produce the toxin then is what makes us sick, the food poisoning. So these conditions, I talked about the ideal conditions for those spores to develop into the toxin, the botulism toxin. The environment is anaerobic or low oxygen level, so less than 2%, low acidic level, which is greater than 4.6, excuse me, 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 120 degrees Fahrenheit are the ideal temperatures. And then, of course, a relatively high moisture environment. So if you look at all four of these and think about inside of a canned food item, all of these conditions are present. So this is what makes botulism so dangerous. And there are a lot of misunderstandings about spoilage only happens under aerobic conditions where oxygen is present. For this particular botulinum, it is anaerobic, so very low oxygen levels, like we show here on this slide. Okay. So how do we prevent botulism, especially in our home canned foods? Obviously, that is what we're talking about today. Spores will not germinate in acidic foods, so anything less than 4.6. Spores are killed when heated long enough at a specific temperature, and that is key to remember for pressure canning, is that long enough at a specific temperature, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, recommends 240 degrees at sea level for canned low acid foods. We talked a little bit about that. Pressure canning is the only safe method for low acid foods, which is why we're here today, to show you how to do that. And the canner must be accurate, operated correctly. Again, we'll go through those steps. And foods must be checked carefully when opening the jars. And later on, we will discuss what those check items we need to look for. So in addition to the last points that we just discussed, it's very important that we are following a scientifically tested, scientifically developed and tested recipes to the T. This is an exact science. You know, a lot of our other cooking and baking experiences that we can do, we can add a little extra here, a little less here and there. But when you're canning, that's the last thing that you want to be doing. You need to follow the recipe exactly. Extra sugar or fat, oversized food pieces, and added thickeners slow down the heat penetration, which is why you will not see any recipes that include that fat, sugar, and thickeners. And getting to the oversized food pieces, that's why it's important, and we talk a lot about this in cooking. The more consistent the sizes of your pieces of food are, the more consistent heat penetration and the better quality that you'll have in that food product. And then the next point is use recommended canners. I have two here today. One, I hope that you can see that, is this one's a little bit taller, and it's the dial gauge. The other one is a weighted gauge, and it's a very similar lid. It just does not have the dial gauge that you saw on the other one. And this particular canner is a little bit shorter and squattier, which works for my particular kitchen situation. Okay, also with canners, when we are done processing them, it's unsafe to cool them unnaturally. So in the past, you may have had people tell you, oh, you can run water over it, you can put wet cold towels on top of it. That is not what you want to do. Let it cool down naturally. It is a long process, but it's definitely worth it, and you'll get a better product and a safe product at the end. So I think we've hit this pretty hard already, that but when we're talking about pressure canning, the pressure itself raises the temperature of the water and the steam internally. You could boil water and boil, no matter how long you boil it, that temperature will never increase. Under pressure, it does. So that is why pressure canning method or processing works for our low acid foods. Okay, I'm just going to, I'm going to just fly through the process, excuse me, but then demonstrate it with the beets that I have here shortly. So I have taken my canner and I have put in 2 to 3 inches. Actually, I use 3 inches of water, and I just have it simmering. So there's just a little bit of steam that's coming out of it. I did not boil the water. As you see on the slide there, if you're using the hot pack method, which the hot and the raw pack methods we will talk about just on the next couple slides. But my simmering water, I haven't actually tested the temperature, but it doesn't even have any bubbles on it. It's just barely steaming. So for your hot pack jars, you would have your simmering water. In addition to that, I have taken my jars and I've checked for cracks or nicks around the top of the jar. And then I've washed these in hot soapy water, rinsed them with hot water, and then let them air dry. And then I am going to place them in that hot water in my canner in order to just equalize the temperature for them when they go have the food packed in them and when they go back into the water to prepare for the processing. So I have my jars in my water. And so our other parts that I have done is I have the lids. You need to check the directions on the manufacturer that you have purchased, because you no longer have to boil your lids. So this particular one I just had to pour, it was just barely hot water, and then I have it just setting in a little pan of water. And then I have a magnetic wand that just makes it easy to pull that out of the can. And then my screw bands, I have washed those as well too, but they're just sitting here by themselves over here, hanging out at the counter here. So our next slide. When we go to fill the jars, or excuse me, sorry, I jumped ahead. Hot packing is when you heat the vegetables first. and then cover it with boiling water or the boiling liquid that typically you've heated those vegetables with. Hot pack method is the best way to remove air, increasing the amount of food that you can actually pack in the jar. Today I am using the raw pack method, which is our next slide. And so all I'm doing in the way I prepped my beets was that you have to get the skin off of them, right? I previously to the last couple years previous to that, I was roasting them in the oven. It was a nice slow way that I felt like I got a consistent way, or consistently I got the skins removed easily. With the boiling water method, that it just felt like it was hit or miss. Today, or actually this last week, what I tried was using the electric pressure cooker, where it's that high steam environment, and the smaller ones took 10 minutes. They probably could have taken 8 minutes. They were just a little bit soft. And then the larger ones I put on for 25 minutes, and they were perfect. I mean, those skins just slide off, and that's my way of, or my preference in being able to take the skin off of the beets. And then I chopped them up into 1/2 inch cubes. So I have decided to cube mine for today. I think next is our fill jar slide. And so we are going to pack it into the jar. I prefer wide mouth jars, just especially with vegetables, so that I can pack them a little bit easier and my hands don't fit in the narrow lid or the narrow necked jars. And that way I can use a spoon rather than having to use my hands. And for this, we will also need a funnel. So I have this type here, and then I also have another one. This one is a little bit narrower than the first one that I showed you. And this is nice because it collapses for storage. So that turns out to be pretty handy. For the hot pack, just because I'll skip the raw pack method since that's the one I'm going to be showing you. But you're just taking spoonfuls of the food product and the liquid and adding that to your jar. And then next slide. Apologize. Yes, the headspace. One of the most important pieces of, okay, they're all very important, but you do need to really watch headspace and create that when you are filling your jars. So the headspace is the amount of empty space from the top of your jar to wherever the top of your liquid and food product are. To help with that, they have created these handy little tools, and it has these stepped ladder measurements. So if I wanted 1 inch, can you see through that jar? So I'll do it on the outside if that helps. So I would not want my food or water to come up above that bottom line right there. If it's 1/2 inch, it would be the second one down. So for most vegetables, it's going to be 1 inch headspace. And again, this is important because it allows, because the food and the liquid are being boiled within the jar, if there is not enough headspace and that liquid and the food start boiling up out of the jar, the air needs to escape. So oddly enough, people don't realize this, the lid needs to come up and let that air expand out of the jar. If the food is coming up and does not, it's closed against that lid, the food and the liquid will leak out, and that will not create the vacuum or the removal of the air that will create the vacuum seal. So very, very important for the headspace. Then we will place our lids on the jar. The screw bands will be very only until it starts to turn the jar. If you're not holding on to it, I'll demonstrate that. And then when we go to take the jar and put it in the canner, we will use what we call a jar lifter. And be sure to use this so that the bottom of the jar lifter is below the neck of the jar, and then we take it over and put it into our canner. We don't want to tip it. Remember, the lid and the screw band will be on. Do not tip it, because then again, you don't want those food particles or that liquid in between the rim and the jar lid to prevent the seal. Okay. We will, like I said, I'll run through this very quick. We'll put the lid onto the canner. One of the things that's important that makes it much easier is to notice on your lid, there will be arrows. There's an arrow on your lid, and then there's an arrow on your handle of the canner. And as long as you get those lined up, it will be very easy to put, here, to put those two together. So I have nothing in this one. And then you want to turn it until those handles actually line up. So if I did not have those lined up, that is not that is not going to seal, and you have a safety risk there. Okay, back to our slide. Then we don't put our weight on, and we don't put or the pressure regulator, depending on which one you're using. We turn the heat up to the highest setting. We want that water to boil. The steam starts to form, and it comes shooting out the vent, which you will want to, we call it venting, for 10 minutes. And that allows that extra air that might be trapped inside the pressure cooker to escape. If that is not allowed to happen, then we don't have our proper temperature that will be able to come up and create the safe product. Again, that is for 10 minutes. And it feels like all the water is going to evaporate out of the canner, and it's quite scary, but it works, and it is a necessary requirement of safe pressure canning. I think, yep, we covered that one. Just to make you aware, if you are reading the, which we do recommend, making sure that you're checking the manufacturer's directions on the canners. If the manufacturers are saying that it's not necessary to vent, that, or let that steam escape, it has to happen. So obviously that may be a situation where the instructions were written prior to the testing of the and where that was developed and decided that it's a safer way to do it rather than not do it. Okay, so here's just a point of reference. So without that proper venting, 30% of the sterilizing value within a 20-minute process will be lost. And at 10 psi, so you're losing basically 20 minutes. And at 10 psi, now I can't even remember. I don't know why it's not showing up on that slide. 60%. Was it double with it? Okay, so after that venting happens, we will place in the pressure regulator onto the canning lid, and that will hold the steam down in. So, and the pressure, as a pressure regulator would do, that'll hold that down inside the canner. And then that will cause it to come up to pressure. And you will notice on the lid, there is this little gadget that goes up and down. So if you look at it from the back, if you put pressure from the inside, it comes up. So that means that pressure has been built inside the canner. As long as that is up, there is a safety mechanism on your pressure canners that will not allow you to take that lid off. So it not only tells you that the pressure is built up and it would be dangerous to take the lid off, but it also engages that safety mechanism so that you cannot remove the lid during the processing. All right. Thank you, Brianna, for switching back and forth. I'm sorry. And then as soon as the, oh yes, let's run this video. I apologize. I had just a little mini video that shows after the exhausting, then I take the pressure regulator or the weighted gauge and place it on the lid so there's not as much hissing going on. And then my next video actually did not turn out, but you can see in the back behind the weighted gauge that the that pin is popped up. Yes, perfect. Okay. So depending on if you're using the dial gauge or the weighted gauge canner, you'll do a slightly different process. So the dial gauge, you would wait until your reading gets up to the amount of PSI that's required for your altitude. And then for the weighted gauge, you wait until that gauge starts to jiggle or rock. And it's not as much as you would think. I personally found that I was over processing because I had my temperature. I was just going for that, that dead on rock, to continual. And after learning that I was over, I had my temperature up too high, so I was actually over processing my foods. So just a slight jiggle is all you need. And then as soon as either one of those, depending on your canner again, as soon as those are up and ready going, that's when you start your timer for the required processing time. For our beets, it is 30 minutes. Okay. And rule of thumb for our altitude, for your dial gauge canners, so 10 pounds of PSI is at sea level. For higher altitude, increase your PSI by ½ pound for every 1,000 feet. Now here's the thing that always makes me laugh, is that we don't have ½ pound weights on the weighted gauge. So if there's these little rings that come off of the weighted gauge, and this by itself is 5. If I put one ring on, this is 10, and if I put the second ring on, that's 15. And excuse me, sorry, I jumped ahead to the weighted gauge. I apologize. But for any altitude over 1,000 feet, you'll want both rings on so that you're pressuring at 15 pounds. Jumping back to the dial gauge, I apologize. You'll just need to watch your dial and add the ½ pound. But typically for most of the area that I've been in, it's 12 to 15 pounds of pressure for our areas. Now, that's not to say that you don't live at a much higher altitude than what I have. So do make sure that you are checking for your local altitude. And also do not can above 10,000 feet. There's the atmospheric pressure and other conditions that just don't provide a safe product. Okay, I think. All right, so probably one of the hardest things is regulating your burner temperature to stay that consistent dial pressure, or your jiggling or the rocking on your weighted gauge. So it's kind of something that you have to experiment with, and different stoves will have different settings for regulating your burners. So if your pressure does drop too much, you need to start over with your timing. So that's why if you are changing the temperature on your stove, do very little increments at a time. Don't jump down to all low, and then you have to start the whole process, the timing process, all over again. Then once our time is up, we turn off the heat and very carefully, remove that canner from the burner. Now, if you have that you're not able to lift it off, and you want to lift it rather than slide it off, otherwise it could damage your stove. But if you just are not able to lift it off, it's best just to leave it on the burner. Yes, it will take longer to depressurize. However, it's safer than you burning yourself and causing a very serious accident. But if you are able to lift it off and put it on some kind of a heat resistant area to let that pressure come down naturally. So the first batch that I did for my beets took an hour and a half from the time that I put the lid on to when, oh, excuse me. Yes, it was an hour and a half by the time then the pressure actually came down and I could open up the lid. So it was actually an hour and 45 minutes because there's another little part that I haven't told you yet. It's next on the next slide. So once you see how do we tell that our pressure has come down? Remember when there was pressure inside the lid, once that pressure has come down and it's no longer in there, this little pin will fall. And that is when you know there's no longer any pressure inside the canner. And then you take off your pressure regulator on either of the canners and you wait 10 more minutes. So that's why I'm saying it was an hour and 45 minutes for my total process before I could actually take the lid off and start pulling out my jars. Okay, and then let's see, I'm sorry, I can't remember if I kept this next slide in or not. I believe, yes, using the jar lifter, you're going to remember, grab that jar around the bottom below the neck of the jar and pull it straight out of the pressure canner and straight down over onto a surface. I like to put mine on a cooling rack just so that it has that extra air circulation around the bottom, as well as when you take your jars out and put them next to each other, you want some space in between those again so that there's enough air circulation to cool those jars down. Once you get them out of the canner, you want them to set there 12 to 24 hours. Do not tighten, and I know we are all tempted to do this. When I pulled mine out, the screw bands were loose, and it took everything I had not to turn those screw bands and tighten them on. But I didn't. So don't push on the lids, just basically use your jar lifter, set them down, let them set there. Make sure everyone in your household also knows, don't be pushing down the middle to see if it's sealed, as we all like to do. And then the next day, you can remove the screw bands, check the seals. So one way to check is to, like I just said, press down on the middle. If it pops back up, that's a problem. That means that it has not sealed. If it's down, then that's great. You know that you have a seal. The other way to do it is to take a metal spoon or a metal utensil and tap the top of that lid. If it rings a high pitch, that is a good thing. That's the sound you want. If it's a dull one, that means that it did not process correctly. And even though the lid is in the down position, but it has that dull sound to it, something went wrong. So that, yes, concave is what we want. That's the word I was looking for, concave, where it's curled or curved down into the jar. So a dull is not what you want. Okay, and then we clean the jars off because, like I said, Sometimes air and a little bit of the liquid does need to come through between the jar and the lid. So you may have some stickiness on the outside of your jar. That's okay. Wipe that down and label so that you remember. I know we all think that we're always going to remember what is what, but how would you know? And sometimes it is just a surprise when you go to open the jar. If you wanted pickled beets for supper, but you picked the beets, just the canned beets, um, you just would adjust. But at the same time, it's better if you do label them. Definitely put the date on there, because more times than not, it happens that it gets pushed to the back of the shelf and you forget it, or you just lose sight of it. So knowing how long it has been in the jar and the method that was used in processing it. Store in a cool, dry, dark place, and best quality is to use it up within a year. So those are pretty simple. And we do this. This has changed, I know, over the years, is storing without your screw bands on. That way you can tell if spoilage is happening, if there's any leaking going on. And that way, when you go to can some more, you have your screw bands, and you don't have to buy new screw bands. Okay, so much earlier in the presentation, I talked about the signs of spoilage, and these are those. Signs of spoilage will show up if it's been incorrectly processed, and it may look normal, but there may be some things you can't always know for sure. But here are some things that will clue you in that there is spoilage. Cloudy canning liquid. Now, there are some minerals and then salt additives that may be in your water that may also cause that. But it's a real cloudiness that you'll see, and it does not look appetizing at all. An unnatural or an off odor, so it does not smell like the way it should. That's a sign of spoilage. Mold growth. Total tells you right there that you don't want to consume that or have others consume it. The jar is not sealed, so maybe the lid popped up and there's, like I said, there might be leakage, or it just comes off really easy. You should not have that happen if it's been properly sealed. I just mentioned that bulging liquids or leaking jars, and then if you pop the lid and liquid squirts out or the food squirts out, again, that's a good sign that it's spoiled and probably fermented, not the properly fermentation, but fermented under the incorrect conditions and unsafe conditions. So I know I used to hear my grandparents talk about this a lot, that they would, just as an extra safety measure, they would take their home canned vegetables and meats and boil them for 10 minutes, an additional minute for every 1,000 feet above sea level. So if you're at 5,000 feet, it would be 15 minutes. And then corn or spinach would be a little bit higher. But if that toxin that creates botulism, it can be boiled away. So if for whatever reason it did get in there, that can actually, or excuse me, the spores. It's specifically the spores, not the toxins. So, and I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but I probably skipped over it. I apologize. But pretty much all of your fresh food will have those spores, the Clostridium botulinum on it. And with oxygen, it can't grow into that, or it can't form into the toxin. So it's safe to be able to eat those products. Once it gets under those ideal conditions that we talked about that creates that toxin, that's where you have the unsafe situation. So that's why, and maybe no one ever explained that to you, as far as why are we boiling this if we already processed it? Now, if there are signs of spoilage, there is a proper way of disposing of those foods. You boil them for 30 minutes and then contain them somehow, so that if they are taken to like a a dump, that the toxin can't spread into the soil as well too. So don't leave it outside to let wandering pets or wildlife eat it, because it can be deadly to them as well too. So okay. Yes, storing your canner, you want to make sure that before you store your canner away that it's thoroughly dried, and not just drying it with a towel. Let it set for a couple of days to make sure that any moisture that was in there does dissipate. And then that includes your lid and your gasket. Do not wash your lid in water, just wipe it down. Older canners you can take off. The petcocks are removable and the safety valves can be washed and dried, and then make sure that you reassemble them properly. Clean openings by running a pipe cleaner, a clean pipe cleaner through them. And this is really hard to see, but this valve, the exhaust valve at the top, that's one of the most important areas that you want to make sure that there's no blockage in there, as well that this pin, the pressure pin, is able to go up and down as well before you even put it away. And then when you bring it back out again, you'll want to check that too. Store some crumbled clean paper towels in it, just in case there is a little bit of moisture that got left. And then wrap it in paper, the lid, and turn it upside down on the canner part and store it away. So there are replacement parts. It's a very good idea to have your local extension agent test your pressure, the dial gauge pressure canners on a regular basis. We recommend yearly, annually, and then checking and replacing your gaskets and the overpressure plugs every 2 years. The overpressure plug is another safety mechanism that if too much pressure builds up in it, that will cause that pressure plug to pop out. And that is safer than if the lid was to explode and come off, where they did have those, I think we all know family members that have heard those stories and carried it down through the generations. And oh yes, if you've lost your weighted gauge, those can be replaced as well too. And Presto has a lot of those online, but if you need help finding those resources, your local extension office can help you find those. So because I'm running out of time, I'm going to jump now. I need to move my video down. And I will demonstrate canning the beets. Brianna, are there any questions yet?
I don't see any questions at the moment, but please feel free to type in any questions that you might have. And I will just reiterate, as Janell mentioned, that your local extension office is a great place to take your canner to get it checked out, just to make sure all of the parts look like they're functioning correctly. And as Janell mentioned, I know that a couple folks had mentioned kind of the concern around using pressure canners, but that's long since the 50s or even the 70s, when a lot of those maybe pressure canning accidents might have occurred. And so getting them tested and checked out by your local extension office is a great way, though, to continue to ensure that they are safe and helpful in the home pressure canning process.
Perfect. Okay, so I have taken the jar that was in the hot water, and I've put my funnel on, and I'm going to spoon my beets that I told you how I prepared them earlier. Kind of pack them down as well as you can. It's always very difficult when you're working with square corners. Even round ones don't always fit in there properly either. And I'm going to keep in mind my 1-inch headspace that I'm going to need with it. So I'm going to call that good. I have, just because of my setup here, I need to take my jar over and get some boiling water in a ladle. And oops, guess what I forgot? My funnel. Oh, before I do that, we haven't talked about salt yet. So when you're using salt with vegetables, it is not part of the preservation. It is for flavor, adding flavor only. So if you were on a salt-free diet, then you would not put salt in. I prefer the salt, so it's a half a teaspoon to a pint, or up to a teaspoon for a quart. So I just poured that in, put my funnel back on. I'm gonna grab some boiling water that I've had sitting here, boiling, and poured a little bit in there. Can you see that okay? And then the same tool that I showed you that helps us to know what our headspace is, on the other end is a handle to be able to push down just between the food and the side of the jar. And do you see those air bubbles that might be coming up? That's important because if there's air pockets inside the jar amongst the food, the temperature may not get to those areas that is required, that we talked about in order to kill those spores. So I am just a little bit high on one of these. So I'm going to take, oops, I might have taken too many. It feels like I'm not putting anything in the jar at all, but it is important to have that 1-inch headspace. And I will add just a little bit more water. And measure again. Oops, gotta have it on the correct line there. I always do this. I need just a little bit more, and then too much ends up being in the jar. And of course, this would have to happen this way while I'm on video. A little bit more. Now, I like to do beets because we have a salad that we like in our family that has, it's like a honey vinaigrette with feta cheese and then chopped up beets and walnuts. And of course, we always have it during the summer, but we always get that little hunger for it during the winter. So this has been one of the ways that we've been able to have that year round. So that's how I use my beets. Anybody else? I am so close. I can't even believe. And does anybody prefer pickled beets over plain beets? Now, if we were doing pickled beets, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say we had some discussion earlier around regular beets versus pickled beets, but I want to hear what you say next.
Okay. So what would we, oh, excuse me, before I go there, the next step I'm doing is I'm taking a wet washcloth and I'm wiping the rim around the top of the jar to make sure that there's no food particles or liquid that will be caught in between our lid and the top of the jar. And then I'm grabbing a lid out of the pan of water that I showed you earlier. Just place that down. Take my screw band. Yeah, this isn't usually that difficult. Gosh. All right. Oh my. But if we were canning the, okay, here I go. So see how when I go to tighten the lid, the jar turns. So I'm not going to hold the jar anymore, and I'm not going to tighten it anymore. I'm going to put my jar lifter down below the collar or the neck of the jar lid. And then I apologize, but you're not going to be able to see this, but I'm going to lift straight up and then go straight back down into the pressure canner. Okay. So, let's see. Why, I'm going to do one more. What would be the processing method that we would use for pickling beets? Anybody out there want to unmute themselves and tell us? Or write it in the chat? If we're, go ahead. You started to say water bath?
Yes.
Yes, and why?
Because it's a high acid.
Water bath.
It's high acid and you're using vinegar.
It's the vinegar that's creating the high acid environment, right? Excellent. Thank you for contributing.
Janelle,
So
as you're filling that up, I did have a couple questions that came in. If you want to, though, I can save them until after you're done packing this jar.
Oh, now would be great.
Perfect. So one question that came in is if we get a new gauge, should it be tested prior to using it?
So the way I would answer that would be to say yes, because with the dial or with any of those components, those parts, during the shipping, things can get bumped around and you never know if that happens. So just to be on the safe side, I would say yes. Have it tested so that you know that when you're starting from that point forward that it is accurate. Brianna, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's perfect. I think when in doubt, it's always great to take your pressure canner, your dial gauge pressure canner to your local extension office just to get that pressure level checked. And then another question that came in is, what about if we're thinking about like a stew or some sort of low acid meal that we might be looking to can, and is it okay to use our own recipes for that?
So as much as we would like to use our own recipes or our, generations before us in our families that they had, those delicious recipes that we all remember growing up with, unless they have been tested scientifically and recently, no, you are not able to use your own recipes. We as consumers just don't have the ability to test under the conditions that they do and to the level that they do. Whether, and I even got a response one time, well, I have the pH meter, can I just test the pH and make sure that it's correct? Well, no, it entails a lot more than just the pH. Again, like we talked earlier, there's the temperature and the amount of time that it processes at that temperature. So that's why they have these food scientists that do this, for a living. And as you noticed, I had too much liquid in there, so I had to remove some. And I still have a little too much, but I'm going to remove the air bubbles because sometimes your liquid goes down to fill those air pocket spaces. So continuing on the using your own recipes, the answer would be to say no. You do need to find tested, approved recipes and we have those resources that we'll show you at the end of this presentation. And while I have it right now, one of the great sources is this So Easy to Preserve book. It follows the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture guidelines, and it comes out of the University of Georgia, who they have been pretty much on the forefront of safe canning practices, and we look to them in their resources. So it's not the answer I'm sure you probably wanted to hear as far as using your own recipes. Now, I should also make sure that I say, in order to have a safe product stored shelf ready, you cannot use your own recipes. if you were to freeze them or, you know, refrigerate them and eat them right up, you know, right away, you could do that. However, to actually put them on the shelf, you know, for up to a year would not be a safe product.
Great. Yes, I always like to say if you can't can it, you can probably freeze it. So there's still ways to have those favorite recipes. It just may not be through the canning process sometimes. And we had one more question that I think is a really great one when you're thinking about pressure canning. And this is an example that came in around someone who had done some pressure canning, and they started out with the 2 to 3 inches of liquid, but by the end of that pressure canning process, there was maybe only a half inch or so of water left, and maybe not even that. And so the question is that still safe, or is that something that we should reprocess?
I'm going to have to defer to you, Brianna.
That's okay. So that's a really great pressure canning process. Sometimes you're losing some of the liquid as that steam is building up, and you're letting it vent as well. So you may end up with less liquid by the time that you finish that canning process. You do want there to still be some liquid remaining, because if at any point the canner runs out of liquid, then it's no longer producing the steam and the pressure to be able to have that proper canning process. So that's why sometimes you have to get to know your canner a little bit to see if you need to be on the higher end or the lower end of that liquid. But if you were to, say, run out of liquid entirely, pressure canning process was done correctly and safely, so you may have to reprocess. But if there is still some liquid left, then you can be fairly sure that the pressure canning process did occur correctly. You just had some liquid loss in that pressure canning process.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to show you then, and how I lost my lid. How could I lose my lid to my canner? Found it. Okay. So remember when I showed earlier, and I apologize for this, but the arrows again. So I have my jars down in the water, and make sure that you do put you know, if you like, I only have 2 jars in there now. So if I was processing just those 2 jars, I would add other jars around it, empty jars, with some water in them, so that the filled jars do not rattle and flip over and obviously cause an improper processing. So then I want to line up my arrows. And so right here, this handle, and then I want to make sure that those handles line up, that they're nice and even, so there's no overhang on either of the handles. And then I'm going to increase my burner temperature up to high. And so this is mine. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to process this. But then turn it up to high. Oops, sorry, my head's cut off, isn't it? Remember that we talked about that pressure will build, the exhaust will happen. So you have a continuous steam coming out for 10 minutes. Then you'll put your weighted gauge on the lid, or the pressure regulator on the dial gauge, and let that come up to pressure on your dial gauge, or your rocking, jiggling on the weighted gauge, and start your timer for the required amount of time. And like I said before, our beets will be processed at 30 minutes at 15 psi. Once those 30 minutes are up, then I will just carefully remove it from the burner, lifting it and setting it on a heat resistant area to pressure down That will take about 15-20 minutes typically, sometimes longer depending on what the volume is in there. And then when I know that the pressure has depressurized, my little pin will go down. I can safely remove the pressure regulator or the weighted gauge, wait 10 more minutes, and that is when you can open your canner, the lid. And one of the things that I did not talk yet about is when you take your lid off, is to remove it away from you, so that if steam does come rushing out, especially with the temperature difference from the inside of the pan to your outside environment, that steam does not come back in and burn you. It's the lid will shield you. One of the other things too is because if you're doing this in the heat of the summer, it becomes very hot because of this high steam environment. There's a lot of heat going on. You may be tempted to open your window or the screen doors, but remember with that, you typically have a change in temperature, and especially airflow, that if you're taking your hot jars out and it hits that much of a difference in temperature, it could cause your jars to crack or break as well too. So just, you know, people coming in and out of the house, you might be able to somehow keep that draft down and prevent that from happening. So I hope that I've shared everything that I needed to. Of course, we are all looking forward to, as extension agents, being able to offer these classes in person someday very soon, and hope that you'll join us for one of those. And I'll let Brianna talk about the next slide.
Additional questions that have come in, I will be sure to respond to those when we also send our pressure canning and water bath canning mock guides, so that you can use them as a resource as you're going through your canning process, along with a few additional resources that we do recommend as those research-based recipes and processes that Janell mentioned so well today. But you'll see here we do have some upcoming opportunities to get more skills and information in these food preservation processes. So we hope that you join us or view the recording later. I also put a link to a survey that you can complete. We would appreciate your feedback on this series and this particular session as well. So take a moment to fill that out if you're able. But know that if you've joined us today, or if you're viewing this recording, we do hope to engage with you further in your food preservation process, and don't hesitate to reach out to your local extension office to get more information and insights along the way. So thank you for sharing with us, and thank you to all who have joined us for your time today. And we wish you a happy food preservation this fall.